Huge shout out and thank you to Timothy, also known as 4Blind on YouTube, for helping me get algorithms and advanced tips and everything to help make this video possible. You can find a link to his channel in the description if you want to know more about blind solving techniques. It is really important that you know all three of these because I will be teaching with the assumption that you do know them. So these will all be in the description if you want to go learn any of those or refresh on them. When you see RW or R wide, that means to turn 2 layers at once. If you see small r, that means to turn only 1 layer and the inner layer. So I'm going to teach it in this order: centers, and then wings, and then corners. And the reason it's done in this order is because if you do not solve in this order, then you may mess up other things with the parity algorithms. Okay, so the first thing we'll learn to solve is the centers, and we need letters for them. So with the SPEFS lettering scheme, we start at the top left and go A, B, C, D clockwise, then left side E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, and U, V, W, X. So the swapping algorithm will be U2, and what that does is it swaps this center with this center. And so A is going to be the buffer, and C is going to be the spot that it swaps to. So what we're going to do is use setup moves to bring other centers up to C, and then we can do U2 to swap them. So I'm going to briefly go over how to do setup moves. There are 3 types of centers: top centers, side centers, and bottom centers. So starting with the side centers, what we can do is bring the center down to any of the sides using one move. So we can bring it down to the front using R prime. And what that does is it puts it down here, so at the bottom right side. Then if we do F prime, then it brings it over to here, which is a different spot. Now it's at the top right. If we did F, then it would bring it to the bottom left. And if we did R, then that would bring it on the back. That would be the top left. So depending on which move we use, we can either bring it to top left, top right, or bottom left, just on a different side. So for example, if I want to swap the buffer with J, then what I have to do is think, okay, J is the top right, so I need to bring this to the top right. And I can do that with F prime like this. And now that it's at the top right, I can move this one over in one move. Then the last move is to put it back up. And then now we haven't disturbed anything in the top layer, but we have changed one centerpiece. We do U2 to swap, and then undo those setup moves. So now we've completed the swap, as you can see. So most side centers are going to work like that. So there are a few exceptions, like the letter K, and the reason is because it's on the bottom right. So if we move this down here to get it on the bottom right, K gets bumped out. So what we just have to do first is move K out of the way. So now it's over here. Now the setup moves will be easier. So we can just move it down to the bottom right and put this back in. U2 and undo the setup moves. A full list of setup moves will be in the description. So now for the bottom centers. It's hard to use setup moves for these, so instead we'll just have an algorithm that can immediately swap over to V. Wide L prime, U prime, small R2, U prime, small L, U, wide R2, U prime, small L prime, U2, wide L, U2. So that swapped the buffer with V. So this works for all bottom centers. You just have to do a setup move first. So like if you want to do W, then you'll do D prime to move it into the V position, then do the swap, and then do D to undo that initial setup move, and we've swapped the buffer with W. Lastly, for the top centers. So if you want to swap with C, of course, that's just going to be a U2. That has no setup moves. If you want to swap with B or with D, then these ones are a little bit trickier. So the algorithm for B goes like this: wide R prime, F prime, U, small r, U prime, wide L prime, U, small r prime, U prime, small L, F, wide R, U2. So it's hard to see that I actually swapped it because they're all white right now, but you can see the logo sticker changed spots. Instead of being over here at B, it has now been swapped over to the buffer position. So I'm not going to show the algorithm for D, but you can find both B and D in the description. So anytime you're doing memorization, if B or D comes second in the letter pair, you have to use the other one instead. So if B came second, you would have to use D in that letter pair instead. And you'll see an example of this soon. Here we're going to see an example of centers, so apply the scramble to your cube. R prime, F2, R, F2. So normally with blind solving, you would start by looking at the buffer and see where this should go. And since this one looks like it's already solved, then we would start a new cycle right away. However, for centers, we don't actually do this because we can move it into a different center spot. So we're not actually going to consider the buffer solved until all of white is solved. In other words, we never start a new cycle until all of the white centers are solved. So this white center can just go right here instead. So the first one we're going to swap with is C, then we see where the blue one should go. that should go over here, which is Q. Yellow should come over to here. We have two options, but whenever we have multiple options, we're just going to pick the one that comes first alphabetically. That way we can keep track of which ones we've already solved. So we're going to pick U, and then white goes not to C because we've already solved that. So it's going to go to D. Then yellow goes not to U, but instead V. Then this one goes to here, which is J. So this piece belongs somewhere at white, but we don't have a spot left for it, which means this one has to go at the buffer. Now that means since white has been completely solved, this ends the cycle. If there were more unsolved pieces, then we would just do a new cycle from here. All right, so just remember that anytime B or D comes second in the letter pair, you have to use the other one instead. So here we see D comes second in the letter pair, so we're gonna have to switch that to B. All right, so starting off with C, that's just no setup moves, so U2. And then now we have Q. So normally we would just move this over here, but Q gets pushed out of the way. So what we have to do first is move it out of the way to here, then do the setup moves like this, U2, and undo setup moves. Next is U, which is a bottom center. So of course, as usual, we have to move it over to V and do the V algorithm. And then do D prime to undo that setup move. Next is D, but we're gonna have to do B instead because it comes second in the letter pair. So that goes like this. Now V, so that's a bottom center and there's no setup moves. And then lastly, J, so that's like this. All right, now we're done because there was an even number of letters. If there was an odd number of letters, we would actually have parity, and in that case, we would do U2, which is the parity algorithm. But since we have an even number, we don't need to do that. Another thing to keep in mind is that parity for centers has nothing to do with parity for wings and parity for corners. So if you get parity for any of these steps, it does not affect whether or not you get parity for the other steps. So since I'm not an expert on 4-blind, the way I'm doing the finger tricks are not necessarily the best way. So if you want to learn more about how to do slices well on 4x4, check out this video on the screen or a link in the description. If you want some more practice with centers, here are some extra scrambles for you to try, and the answers for them in letters will be in the description. All right, so now we're looking at the wings, and this one is quite easy to execute if you already know M2. In fact, it's almost exactly the same. However, we're going to need to spend some time on how to memorize this. So the lettering already starts out a bit tricky, but make sure you remember how these rules go. So we start by looking at the top, and the top right actually is going to be A. Then this one is going to be B, this one is C, and this one is D. So how you remember which ones we're actually going to letter is whichever one is farther along clockwise. So if you just draw a circle clockwise, then you can see that this one is farther along clockwise, this one's farther along clockwise, so that's B, and the next one here is C, and then D is also farther along clockwise, so this one is D. So going to the left side now, notice that D was over here, and we missed this one. But if you look at the left side, this top right is going to be E. So we actually do have a name for it. This is E, F, G, H. I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X. Now, believe it or not, every single wing does have a letter. This one is A, and this one is Q. If you look at the back over here, this one's actually the one further along clockwise, and it's at the top. So this one is Q. Now we only need one letter for every wing and we don't need two letters. And the reason is because you cannot misorient a wing. So you actually cannot have flipped wings. You can only have wings in the wrong spot. So the buffer is going to be this one over here, which is the letter U, and the target is going to be A over here. Basically exactly the same as M2. We're going to be doing R2 instead, which is almost the same thing, to do swaps. Now this is where it's really great. The setup moves are almost exactly the same as M2. So for example, with M2, if I want to swap to J, what I do is U, R, U prime, M2 to swap, and undo the setup moves. And so now I've swapped this one with this one. J is one of these two wings, and to see which one it is, you know that J goes on the front, so this is I, this is J. This one instead would be P. So to swap with J, we just do the same setup moves. U, R, U prime, R2, and then undo. Now there are going to be some exceptions where your regular M2 setup moves don't work anymore, and those are going to be the ones in the M slice. So for example, with M2, if you want to swap to C, you do U2 M prime, U2 M prime. But on a 4x4, if you do that, you end up with a lot of things off. So if you run into anything in the M slice, I just recommend checking the description for the algorithm. So anytime I or S comes second in the letter pair, you have to change to the opposite one. There will be an example of this coming up soon. All right, now we're going to see an example of wings. All right, so here we have 5 unsolved wings. And the buffer is already solved, so we have to start a new cycle right away. I'm just going to pick this piece over here. And actually, what letter is this piece? Now you might say if you choose the front it's I, if you choose the top it's C, but that's actually not true. This wing itself is I. Remember, each wing has only one letter. This one, in fact, is C. So how you know is just think about the farther along clockwise rule that I talked about. This one is farther along clockwise on the top face, as in it's more clockwise than its partner. This one is farther along clockwise on the F face because it's more clockwise than its partner. So since this one's farther along clockwise on the front face, we go with the front, and the front has this labeled as I. So next we see where this should go. It's white of white green, which means it comes basically to the same spot, but it actually goes over to here because it's the white of the white green that we're looking at. So it has to go onto the white side, then pick the spot farthest along clockwise on the white green. So that's going to be this one. So this is the letter C. Next we see that this is white of white blue. So again, we look at the white side. White blue is on the top here. It's one of these two. Then we pick the one farther along clockwise. So this is going to be the letter A. Next, this is green of white green. So we go to the green side, see where white green is one of these two, then pick the one farther along clockwise. So this is the letter I again. So we've ended the cycle and we have two more unsolved pieces. So I'm just going to start with this one because I want to. And this is going to be the letter, we can't choose B because it's not farther along clockwise on the white side. So this has to be M. Next, we see where this orange of the white orange should go, and that should go over to here. Well, it's kind of obvious now because it's the only unsolved one. But in reality, on an unsolved cube, you probably have to pick between these two. And again, since we're looking at orange, then this one has to be it because it's farther along clockwise on the orange face. Next, we see where this should go, and it should go over to here because it's red, and this one is farther along clockwise on the red face. All right, so before we go through that execution, very similar to centers, we look at our letter pairs, and anytime that I or S comes second in the letter pair, you have to swap it to its opposite one. So I just happens to be the same as on a 3x3, and it goes like this. All right, next we have C, which is actually different from a 3x3, so that one goes like this. Next is A, which is the same. Next is I again. Make sure since it's second in the letter pair, you're actually going to choose S. So the algorithm for S is actually the same as on a 3x3, and it goes like this. And next we have M, which is the same as on a 3x3. Then we have E. Then we have M. Since we memorized an odd number of letters, we now have parity, so we do the parity algorithm, which goes like this. Every R that I say is just a small r. R prime, U2, R, U2, R prime, U2, X rotation, which means face the bottom, R, U2, R, U2, R, U2, R2, U2, X prime, which means face the top again, R prime, U2. If you want some more practice with wings, here are some extra scrambles you can try out, and their answers in letters will be in the description. Corners are exactly the same as you would do them in Old Pacman, so I'm not going to go over it again. There's an Old Pacman tutorial in the description if for some reason you forgot how to do it. For this tutorial, the buffer will be at E and the target will be at V. And again, the swapping algorithm is just a Y perm without the F moves in the beginning or the end, so like this. Parity is handled a bit differently though, so let's get into that. So this is like the simplest scramble ever. We look at the buffer. This is green of the white, orange, green, and it should go over to here, which is the letter I. And now since we've reached the buffer piece, then that's it. So since we've memorized an odd number of letters, then we have parity here as well. So I'm just going to do the swap first. F, R prime to setup, and then swap, and then R, F prime. All right, and now we have parity. So this is just an adjacent PLL parity. So we're just going to do U2 and then solve this and then do U2 to put everything back. So how that's done is with RU, R prime, U prime, and then PLL parity algorithm, and then U prime, R prime. Then just do U2 to put everything back. All right, so before we get into the full example solve, I just want to say that if you have any of these two questions, how do I remember all of this? Because there will be a lot. And how do I know when I've finished memorizing a certain step? Both of these questions will be answered at the very, very end after the example solve is completed. All right, so white top and green front do this scramble. So since we don't have any centers, you can actually hold the cube any way you like, which means we're going to choose the way that solves the most number of centers at once. So for example, green has 2 done here, red has 2 done here, so we could hold green front and red on the right here. That way we automatically solve 4 centers. There is a better way to do it for this particular scramble though, and we're going to put green on front and yellow on the bottom. And that also solves 2 orange centers on the side here. So you have to be very familiar with the color scheme because there are no set centers here. And then of course these 2 reds are not solved because they belong on the right side. All right, now we're starting with center memorization. So we look at the buffer, and the buffer is solved, but we're not going to consider it solved. Remember, anytime white is here, we're not going to start a new cycle until all of the white centers are solved. So we're going to start by swapping this one over to B. Then we see where this one should go, and this should go to M. Yellow should go to U. Blue should go to Q, orange should go to E, green should go to I, white should go to not B, not the buffer, so it never goes to the buffer. It's not going to B because we already solved B, so it's going to C instead. Red is going to not M because we solved that, so it's going to go to N. Blue is going to not Q, but instead R. White is going to the last available white spot, so D. Blue goes to S because we've solved Q and R. Then red goes to O, the last available red spot. Orange goes to G, the last available orange. White goes to, and we've already solved all of white. So that means we have to start a new cycle now because we consider this one to be the buffer piece. The last white piece is the buffer. So we can just pick any unsolved piece, but I picked L. And then yellow, this one goes to the last available yellow, which is going to be X. Blue goes to the last available blue, which is T. Green goes to the last available green, which is L, and that ends the cycle because it's back to where we started the cycle. It shouldn't be very hard to know if you finished or not because on each side we did go in alphabetical order. So now we're doing edge memorization, and so we start by looking at the buffer. This is orange of orange-white. So as always, what we do is, okay, orange is on the orange side, orange-white is this piece over here. So this is the letter E, and then of these 2, we're gonna pick the one farther along clockwise. So this is the next one we go to. So for blue-yellow, we go to the blue side, look at the side that touches yellow. So this is going to be the letter S. Then we pick the one that's farther along clockwise. So that's going to be yellow-blue, and that's the next one we go to. So going to the yellow side, then this is the side that touches blue. So that's the letter W. Then we pick the one farther along clockwise, which is this one. And so we'll go through the rules one more time, then I'll go a bit faster. So this is white, red. So we go to the white side, this is red, and then so this is the letter B here. And then we pick the one farther along clockwise, so that's going to be this one. All right, now so I'm just gonna go through the rest of the letters faster. This one is going to be Q. This one will go to M. This goes to K, which goes to A, which goes to D, which goes to T, which goes to L, and then O, and then I, and then F, and then P, and then J, and then V, C, G, H, X, and this is the buffer piece again. So then we finish this cycle and we go to a new cycle. Now, we only go to a new cycle if there are pieces left, and we have memorized a lot, but there actually are more pieces left to be solved. And how I know this, you can wait till the end of the video where I explain how you know if you finished memorization for wings or not. So one piece we haven't visited yet is actually N. So this one goes to R, which comes back to N. So that ends this cycle, and that ends memorization for wings. You should already know how to do corners, so I'll just speed through this one a bit. So we start by looking at the buffer. This one goes to W, and that's the buffer again, so we start a new cycle. I'm gonna start the new cycle on V. So we start with V, and we go to C. This one goes to G. This one goes to S, which goes to P, which ends the cycle. Then we start a new cycle on any unsolved piece. I'm gonna start with B here, which goes to F, which goes to N, and that ends this cycle as well because B and N are the same piece. So now remember what I said in the beginning of the video, execution has to be done centers and then wings and then corners. So now we're doing execution for centers, and just keep in mind that for B and D, if they ever come second in a letter pair, you have to use the other one instead. So starting with B, this comes first in a letter pair, so we just do B. M, which is like this, setup, swap, undo setup. U, which is over here, so we have to move it over to V and then do the V algorithm. and then undo that setup from the beginning, so D prime. Q, which is like this. E, I, C, which is no setup moves. N, so I'm going to rotate left always. Anytime I have to rotate, I'm just going to rotate to the left. Next is R, and I recognize that R requires a rotation as well, so I'm not going to rotate back to the front right away. I'm just going to do R. D, which comes second in the letter pair, so we're going to do B instead. S, O, G, L, and instead of rotating to the right, I'm going to rotate to the left so that I'm consistent with how I rotate. X, which is here, so I have to do D2 and then do the algorithm for V. And then make sure I undo that setup from the beginning, so D2. T, which is like this. And then L. So that did complete all of the centers, but since we did an odd number of letters, then we have to do the parity algorithm now. The parity algorithm for centers is just U2. So now we're doing execution for the edges, and quick reminder for the edges, anytime you get only I or S, these are the only two that have the special case. If you get I or S second in the letter pair, you have to use the other one instead. So I'm going to kind of speed through this because it's either you do the algorithm that's shown in the description, or this is already the same as M2. So E, which is the same as M2. S, which comes second in the letter pair, so we have to use I instead. And this is actually the same I from M2. All right, now I'm just going to start going faster. All right, now W. B. Q. M. K. A. D. T. L. O. I, which comes first in the letter pair, so we don't need to switch it. F. P. J. V. C. G. H. And for H, it was really important that I did that particular setup move, and so you'll find that in the description. Don't use the one with like wide moves because that will not work on a 4x4. All right, next is X. N. So same thing goes for N. Do not use the one with wide moves. Instead, use the one that I just showed. R. N. All right, that solved all the edges, and since there was an even number of edges, there is no parity here. But if there was parity, we would do the parity algorithm. All right, lastly, this is corners. Not really going to explain much because it's the same as old Pachman. W. V. C. G. S. P. B. F. N. And since we memorized an odd number of letters, we have to do the parity algorithm. So that's U2, adjacent PLL parity, and then U2. All right, so now the 2 questions I said I would answer. How do you know when you finish memorizing for any particular step? There are a lot of wings, so it's really hard to keep track of which ones you've been to and which ones you haven't been to yet. So it'll come more naturally with practice, and you'll have an easier time being able to tell which wings you have not been to yet. But there is a trick you can use to see how many you should be memorizing. So the trick is to do a quick calculation to see how many letters you should be memorizing. Number of pieces, -1, minus solved pieces, plus new cycles. So for example, there are 24 wings, subtract 1 is 23. Let's say the Scramble did not give me any solved wings. So this would be -0, still 23. And then I've made 2 new cycles, so that's 25. If I think I'm done, but I've only memorized 22 letters, then I must have some pieces that I haven't solved yet. You can also use this for centers, but you probably don't need this for centers because it's a lot easier to tell when you finish centers. All right, so now how do I memorize all these? Because that's a lot of letters. So the way that I talked about in the 3x3 blindfolded video is to turn each letter pair into images and then memorize a story out of it. So put all these images one after another and turn that into a story. But there's another method that people tend to use for big blind and multi-blind, and that's called journey memorization. This is where instead of making a story out of the images, you have a location that you know well and you put objects in there. Now, I'm not an expert on this, so instead I'm going to put a link in the description to a video about journey memorization. So a quick note about memorization order. I've taught it as centers, wings, corners, but if you do it as corners, wings, centers, then there are some advantages you can get out of this. One advantage is that there's no time between memorizing centers and executing centers, which means that you can put centers into short-term memory. If you have any further questions, you can leave it in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys all next time.